All right, so today we're going to kind of jump right into it. Some choppy waters, the world of international trade, and a recent spat between the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah.
You've sent us a ton of news articles and even some pretty heated Reddit threads, and it seems like they all kind of revolve around this one central clash. Ontario Premier Doug Ford versus President Trump.
Oh, yeah.
And their weapons of choice, steel tariffs, and electricity surcharges.
Intense.
Buckle up, because this is going to get interesting.
It's pretty wild how, a regional decision, in Ontario like this could trigger such a huge international incident.
Right.
It really shows just how interconnected everything is when we talk about global trade and, maybe even exposes some, raw nerves in that U.S.-Canada relationship.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not the first time that these two countries have kind of butted heads over trade,
Right,
but
absolutely.
there's a long history there, right?
A lot of history there, yeah. This is all kind of happening against a backdrop of existing trade tensions, especially those stemming from Trump's 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum.
Right.
And that move really stoked resentment, I think, among Canadians. It felt like a betrayal from a close ally. And, that sentiment has really lingered.
Yeah.
Then along comes Doug Ford, kind of adding fuel to the fire with his own retaliatory 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 U.S. states.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly was Ford trying to achieve with that surcharge? Was this like a strategic move, or was it more of an impulsive reaction?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Some analysts think it was a calculated attempt to appeal to his base and portray himself as this strong leader standing up to U.S. pressure. Others argue that it was a miscalculation and, ultimately backfired and ended up hurting Ontario's economy.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely got a reaction from the states that were affected by the surcharge.
For sure.
Not to mention from Trump himself. He didn't exactly mince words.
No, he did not.
He was threatening to double the existing tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel in response.
Yeah, well, and that's classic Trump, right? That kind of aggressive rhetoric using public pronouncements to apply maximum pressure.
Right.
It's a tactic he's used over and over again, in trade negotiations. But the timing is interesting, too. I got to remember that the Americans had just suspended implementing those tariffs for 30 days before this electricity surcharge issue kind of blew up.
So what do you make of that? Was it just a coincidence, or was there maybe something more strategic going on?
It's hard to say for sure,
Right.
But it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Right.
Maybe it was a deliberate strategy to, catch Canada off guard, or maybe it was more reactive, a way for Trump to assert his dominance and just show that he's not going to be pushed around. Either way, it put Ford in a really, really tough spot.
Yeah, because now he has to choose between backing down or escalating this conflict even further. And what's so interesting is that we saw both reactions from him in a really short period of time.
Yeah, it was a whirlwind.
He initially came out super defiant, saying we don't roll over to anyone. But then almost immediately, he completely flipped, suspending the surcharge and agreeing to meet with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
Yeah, talk about a roller coaster.
Right. It was like whiplash.
It was a wild ride.
That rapid change, of course, definitely raised some eyebrows.
Yeah.
Some people saw it as a sign of weakness, caving to U.S. pressure.
Yeah.
Others interpreted it as a savvy political maneuver.
Right.
De-escalate the situation, buy some time for negotiations.
Yeah.
But whatever the motivation was, it definitely caused a lot of debate.
Oh, for sure.
And uncertainty, not only within Canada, but beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of reverberated outward.
So we've been talking a lot about the political side of things, but what about the economic implications of all this back and forth? There are real world consequences for businesses and for workers on both sides of the border, right?
No, absolutely. The steel and aluminum industries are obviously the ones that are in the spotlight right now, and they're feeling it,
Oh, right.
We're talking about potential job losses, price hikes, disruptions to supply chains.
Yeah.
But the ripple effects, I think, could extend way beyond just those sectors.
Sure.
Think about the manufacturers that rely on those materials, or even the consumers who are the ones ultimately footing the bill.
Yeah, paying those increased costs.
Exactly.
And that brings up another really important point, the human cost of this trade dispute.
Yeah.
What about all the people whose livelihoods depend on these industries?
Yeah.
How are they being impacted by all of this uncertainty and political posturing?
It's easy to get caught up in the high stakes drama of it all. But we can't forget that there are real people who are being affected by these decisions,
Sure.
They're facing job insecurity, financial stress, and just a lot of anxiety about the future.
And it's not just those directly involved in, those specific industries either.
Right.
When you have this kind of disruption to international trade,
Yeah.
it creates a ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
Exactly.
Potentially leading to slower growth, reduced investment, and just a general feeling of unease.
A sense of instability.
Right. And then let's not forget about the potential damage to the relationship between Canada and the U.S.
Of course.
They've been close allies for so long.
For a very long time, yeah.
But these trade disputes can really erode trust and cooperation.
Yeah.
It creates this climate of uncertainty that just makes it harder for businesses to operate and for governments to collaborate on other issues.
It really throws a wrench in the system.
Right. So it sounds like Ford's actions, whether they were, intentional or not, have really thrown a wrench into the gears of this Canada-U.S. trade relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
So
it remains to be seen how things will play out from here. But what's clear is that this situation has exposed, I think, some of the vulnerabilities and complexities of international trade,
right,
especially in a world where political considerations often clash with economic realities.
Yeah, and it seems like this whole thing has gotten so much attention.
It really has.
Especially considering that it started with a regional decision in Ontario. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think it taps into, this broader sense of unease that a lot of people are feeling about the state of global trade and international relations in general.
Yeah.
We're in this period of heightened uncertainty, right? With rising protectionism and geopolitical tensions and even this kind of questioning of these traditional alliances. And I think this dispute between Canada and the U.S., two countries that have historically been such close partners, it's kind of seen as a symptom of that larger trend.
So this incident with Ford and the electricity surcharge is sort of like a microcosm of these bigger issues playing out on a global scale.
Exactly. I think it highlights those challenges of, balancing national interests with this need for international cooperation.
Right.
And, in today's world, it seems like countries are increasingly looking inward, prioritizing their own domestic concerns over these global partnerships.
Right.
And that can definitely lead to friction, as we're seeing here.
Speaking of looking inward, let's talk about Doug Ford himself for a minute.
Right.
He's a pretty polarizing figure, even within Canada.
For sure.
Some people see him as a strong leader who's not afraid to stand up for, what he believes in.
Yeah.
While others kind of view him as impulsive and reckless. What's your take on his political style and how that might have influenced his actions in this whole situation?
Well, Ford has definitely cultivated this image as a populist leader, someone who's not afraid to shake things up and challenge the status quo.
Right.
He often frames himself as, a champion of the little guy, someone who's fighting against elites and special interests.
Right.
And I think that approach has really resonated with a certain segment of the population, particularly those who feel like they've been left behind by globalization and, traditional politics.
So how does that tie into his handling of this trade dispute?
It's possible, I think, that those populist instincts led him to take a more confrontational approach with the U.S., believing that would play well with his base.
Right.
The initial decision to impose the electricity surcharge could be seen as, an attempt to project strength and defiance,
right,
a way of signaling that, he wasn't going to back down from a fight.
But then he made that very quick reversal.
Right.
Suspending the surcharge and agreeing to negotiate.
Yeah.
Does that contradict, this whole tough guy persona that he's built for himself?
Not necessarily. I think,
okay,
some people might see it as a sign of pragmatism,
right,
a willingness to, adapt and compromise when the situation calls for it. Others might view it as more of a strategic retreat, a way to buy time and kind of regroup before the next round of negotiations.
It seems like there are so many different interpretations of his actions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really hard to know for sure what his motivations were.
Right. It's all speculation at this point.
But one thing's for sure, this whole episode has put him in the international spotlight.
Oh, absolutely. It's front page news.
And it's raised questions about his judgment.
Yeah.
And his ability to, navigate these complex international issues.
Yeah, for sure.
And, there have even been comparisons made between him and Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah. Those are inevitable.
Do you see any validity in those comparisons?
Well, on the surface, there are some similarities.
Right.
Both Ford and Trump are these businessmen turned politicians who campaigned on, these populist platforms, promising to shake up the establishment. They both have this tendency to use, very blunt language, and they both kind of eschew these traditional diplomatic norms.
Right.
And I think they both have this knack for connecting with, a certain segment of the electorate who feel disenfranchised by the political system.
So it's more than just the fact that they both have a penchant for Twitter.
Yeah, I think it goes a little deeper than that. There's like a shared style,
Right.
a way of approaching politics that emphasizes disruption and this kind of rejection of conventional wisdom.
But of course, they're also very different individuals.
Yeah.
With their own unique backgrounds and experiences.
For sure.
Ford's political career really started in Toronto.
Yeah.
Serving as a city councilor alongside his brother, the late Rob Ford.
Right.
Who was also a very, colorful and controversial figure.
That's one way to put it.
And it was during that time that Ford, really honed his political skills.
Yeah.
Learning how to navigate the often, rough and tumble world of municipal politics.
It's a tough game.
He made a run for mayor back in 2014.
Yeah.
After his brother dropped out due to health issues, but he ended up losing to John Tory.
Right.
And then in 2018, he shifted his focus to provincial politics.
Yeah.
He won the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party in Ontario.
Right.
And ultimately became premier.
A pretty impressive trajectory.
It is a pretty remarkable rise, especially considering that, he doesn't come from a traditional political background.
Yeah, it really speaks to his ability to connect with voters on an emotional level, to tap into their frustrations and their aspirations.
But it also raises questions about whether those same skills will translate to, the international stage.
Yeah, that's one of the big unknowns here.
Right.
Can Ford effectively represent Ontario's interests in this complex global environment, that requires diplomacy and nuance and a deep understanding of international relations?
Yeah.
I guess only time will tell.
Right. But what we do know is that, this situation with the U.S. trade dispute is a major test for him.
Right. For sure.
It's an opportunity for him to show whether he can be a statesman or whether he'll kind of revert back to that more confrontational style.
Yeah.
That's become his trademark.
It'll be interesting to see how he adapts.
And it's not just a test for Ford.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's a test for Canada as a whole.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think this situation has exposed, some of the vulnerabilities that Canada faces in this world where, traditional alliances are being questioned and the rules of global trade are being rewritten. It's forced Canadians, I think, to confront some uncomfortable questions about their place in the world and their relationship with, their most powerful neighbor.
So it's about more than just tariffs and surcharges.
Oh, way more. Yeah. It's about Canada's identity, its economic future, and its ability to navigate this, rapidly changing global landscape.
Yeah. It's fascinating how, something that seems so regional, like an electricity surcharge in Ontario, can have, these huge implications for Canada's place on the world stage.
Yeah. It really underscores the interconnectedness of our globalized world.
Right.
In today's economy, what happens in one corner of the globe can quickly ripple outward.
For sure.
Impacting businesses and governments and individuals, across continents.
And in this case, those ripples are, being felt especially strongly in the relationship between Canada and the U.S.
For sure.
We've already touched on, some of the historical context of the trade tensions between these two countries.
Yeah.
But this situation just seems to have really brought those underlying tensions to the surface.
Yeah, it's almost like this specific dispute is acting as a pressure point, revealing the cracks that have been developing in that Canada-U.S. relationship, for some time now.
Yeah.
There's this sense, I think, that those old assumptions about the strength and the stability of that partnership are being challenged.
And that brings us to CUSMA.
Yeah.
The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement.
Right.
This updated trade deal that replaced NAFTA back in 2020.
Yeah.
And now it's being put to the test.
Big time.
At this trade dispute.
Yeah.
So what do you think this situation reveals about, the strengths and weaknesses of CUTSM?
Well, CUTMA was designed to modernize and strengthen trade relations between the three countries.
Right.
But this situation, I think, shows that even with, a new agreement in place, there's still potential for friction and disagreements,
Of course.
It raises questions, I think, about the effectiveness of those dispute resolution mechanisms within CUSMA and whether, those mechanisms are really robust enough to handle these kinds of high-stakes political clashes.
It's almost like a stress test for the agreement.
Yeah, exactly.
Can it withstand these kinds of pressures, or will it kind of buckle under the weight of political maneuvering?
Right, and the outcome of this dispute, I think, could have some pretty significant implications for the future of CUSMA.
Right.
If it's not handled effectively, it could set a precedent for future disagreements, and undermine confidence in the agreement's ability to actually promote fair and predictable trade.
So a lot is riding on how this situation plays out.
For sure.
Not just for Canada and the U.S., but also for Mexico, the third partner in this trade agreement.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not just about, the economic implications either. There are geopolitical considerations at play here, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this trade dispute is happening against, this backdrop of shifting global power dynamics with the U.S., increasingly asserting its dominance and challenging these traditional alliances. And Canada kind of finds itself in this really delicate position, trying to maintain those close ties with the U.S. while also, asserting its own sovereignty and pursuing its own interests.
So how do you see this all playing out? What are some of the possible scenarios for the future of this trade dispute? And what are the potential consequences for Canada, the U.S., and the wider region?
Well, one possibility is that, the meeting between Ford and Lutnick leads to a de-escalation of the conflict.
Okay.
They could reach a compromise on the tariffs and surcharges, perhaps with some, face-saving concessions on both sides. This would be, the most optimistic outcome, I think, allowing trade relations to stabilize and preventing, further economic damage.
But there's also the possibility that the meeting doesn't produce a breakthrough.
Right.
And that the trade dispute just continues to simmer, or even escalates further.
Yeah. That's definitely a risk, and it's one that both sides need to be mindful of.
For sure.
A prolonged trade war would be harmful to everyone involved. Disrupting supply chains, increasing costs for consumers, and potentially leading to job losses on both sides of the border.
Right.
And, it could also kind of poison the relationship between Canada and the U.S., making it harder to cooperate on other issues.
Right, like security and environmental protection.
Exactly, all of those things.
And let's not forget about the potential impact on investor confidence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Uncertainty is never good for business.
It's a killer.
And a protracted trade dispute would create this climate of uncertainty that could, deter investment and slow economic growth.
Absolutely.
In both countries.
Yeah, it's a lose-lose situation for everyone.
So what can listeners, take away from all of this? Why should they care about this trade war playing out, thousands of miles away?
Because in our interconnected world, what happens in one part of the globe can really affect us all.
Right.
These kinds of trade disputes can have ripple effects on the global economy.
For sure.
Potentially impacting prices and jobs and even the availability of goods and services.
Yeah.
It's a reminder, I think, that we're all part of this complex and interdependent system.
Right.
And that the decisions made by governments and businesses can have really far-reaching consequences.
And it also highlights, I think, the importance of, staying informed about these issues.
Oh, absolutely.
Trade policy can seem kind of, dry and technical sometimes.
Right.
But it has a direct impact on our lives.
Yeah.
Whether we realize it or not.
For sure, our everyday lives are affected by these decisions.
So Doug Ford's actions have really thrown a spotlight, I think, on this complex and often tense relationship between Canada and the U.S.
Absolutely.
Particularly when it comes to trade.
Yeah.
And we've seen, how a seemingly regional decision can escalate into an international incident with potentially far-reaching consequences.
For sure, it's a bit of a cautionary tale.
And it's raised some important questions, about Canada's place in the world, its economic future, and the role of political leadership in navigating, these turbulent times.
It's a lot to think about.
We've covered a lot of ground today. But there's still so much to be learned and discussed.
Yeah.
As this situation continues to unfold.
Absolutely.
We encourage you to, stay engaged.
Yeah.
To keep asking questions.
For sure.
And to consider the broader implications of, these trade disputes. For our interconnected world.
It's a global issue.
So, till next time, stay curious. And thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks, everyone.